Continuing our discussion from class, tonight's video deals with the different types of bias that can occur in sampling. Please remember to pause the video when you need to so that you can write down all the necessary information. Please take out a clean sheet of paper, put your name on that paper and the date, and title it Bias and Sources of Bias. And then you'll show me this paper tomorrow in class for your grade. Bias is a form of error that occurs when we're sampling and doing studies in statistics because it causes your results to have a favored outcome. It's dangerous in statistics because if you have bias present in your sampling and in your study, then your study is not accurate and is not well received. Anything that causes your data to be wrong is bias. It can be attributed to the person performing the research. If you're doing the study, maybe you didn't do it correctly, maybe you didn't ask questions that were proper and they were leading questions. It can also be attributed to the person that's responding to the questioning for your sample, or to the sampling method itself, because you didn't use the correct sample when providing it. There are several different sources of bias, and these are the things that can cause there to be bias in your sample. And because of that, you can't do anything with the data that you've collected because it makes that data then not usable. The first type is voluntary response. Voluntary response means that the people chose to respond, or people choose to respond. When you get people that choose to respond in a survey or in a study, generally those people have a very strong opinion, either for or against what you're talking about. And so that will lead to bias in your sample. For example, when you have surveys in magazines that ask readers to mail in the survey, or people don't usually mail anything in anymore, but you could email in a survey, or you could respond to an internet survey on a particular website. Also, other examples would include shows that you call in and vote, because people have volunteered themselves to participate. So remember, in voluntary response, the person selects themselves to participate in the survey. Again, self-selection is voluntary response. Another type or source of bias is convenience sampling, and that occurs when you ask people that are easy to ask to respond to your questions, and biased results can be produced. For example, in the mall, they tend to have some people walking around trying to get people to participate in surveys. And generally, the people conducting the surveys look for people that are friendly, or maybe people that fit a certain criteria based on looks. And so they select only these people that they are deeming worthy of their survey, and then those results are going to be biased as a result of that. Another example is when you see the little responding cards at restaurants. Only people that have a strong opinion, whether good or bad for that restaurant, are going to respond on those survey cards. And so then it's not a good representation of an entire population for your sample. Now, although the data attained in these convenience samplings is biased, that method is also often used for surveys, and the results are often reported in newspapers and magazines. I think I mentioned the first period about how a statistics class in Arizona responded to an internet survey for a newspaper about who was going to be selected as a vice presidential candidate in the 2008 election. And because this internet poll had no limit to the number of times you could respond, they all chose a very unknown person, and that person ended up winning that poll, even though no one had really even heard of that person. Our next type of bias, or source of bias, is undercoverage, and that's when some groups of the population are left out of the sampling process. So, for example, suppose you were doing a survey by randomly selecting names from a phone book. Everybody is not going to be represented from the entire population. Number one, because people sometimes have numbers that are unlisted, and usually these are people that are more high income. Also, you're going to have people without phone numbers at all, and sometimes those are usually low-income families. Or people with only cell phones, which are not going to be listed in your traditional phone book. And this used to be generally just young people, but it's getting more and more popular as we move on in technology and whatnot. And so everybody in the population would not be represented by this type of sampling because it doesn't cover everybody. Our next source of bias is non-response. This occurs when the individual cannot be contacted or they refuse to participate. And that happens a lot with telephone surveys because nobody likes telemarketers anymore these days because they generally tend to bother people. And also we kind of talked about the traditional U.S. Census in our class, how people can be kind of difficult to deal with in responding to that. So in a non-response bias source situation, people are chosen by the researchers, but those people refuse to participate. So they didn't self-select themselves to participate, so don't confuse it with voluntary response. It's people that refused to participate. And because of the telemarketing efforts in the past few years, there's a major problem with non-response when we're talking about telephone surveys. Even if you're not trying to sell something, because people have tried to sell things, no one wants to participate in a phone survey either. One way to try to help the problem of non-response is to follow up with people and contact the people that are not home when you make your initial contact. But still, a lot of times if people see an unrecognizable number with caller IDs that we have nowadays, oftentimes they don't answer it, or an 800 number, or any number they don't recognize, people don't answer anymore. Our next source is response bias. That occurs when the behavior of the respondent or the interviewer causes bias in the sample. And as a result, you get wrong answers. So, for example, suppose we want to do a survey of high school students on drug abuse or alcohol abuse, and we use a police officer in uniform to interview each student. Do you really think we're going to get honest answers from people when we're talking about something that's illegal to a police officer? And the answer is, of course, no, you're not. If you're going to do some kind of survey like that, it's better to do an anonymous survey where people's answers are not traced to them and not conducted by a police officer. So again, response bias occurs when you get incorrect answers as a result of either something that the interview has done or that something that the person responding has done. Another source of bias can be wording of questions. How a question is worded can sometimes influence the answers that are given. In a series of questions, the interviewer can word in such a way as to lead their person they're interviewing to a certain answer that they really want for their study. And also, if we use big words or technical words that the general population might not understand completely, that can also affect your response. You have to word questions as neutral as possible so that you don't influence the response. Otherwise, your data is not going to give a true and accurate report. The level of the vocabulary used should be appropriate for the population you're surveying. So, for instance, if you're surveying somebody that lives in a place that is not known to be a place that has people that have been to college or people that are well-read, then you shouldn't use a complex vocabulary that those people may not understand. At the same time, if you're interviewing people that are on maybe they're on the campus of Harvard University, those people might have a wider range of vocabulary so you could use more complex technical wording. To finish up, we're going to decide which type of bias fits each situation. So this first one, it says, before the presidential election of 1936, FDR against Republican Landon, the magazine Literary Digest predicted Landon winning the election in a 3-2 victory. A survey of 10 million people they had conducted. George Gallup surveyed only 50,000 people and predicted that Roosevelt would win. The Digest survey came from magazine subscribers, car owners, telephone directories, and etc. So which type of bias would fit this situation? And that would be undercoverage. Because the Digest survey comes from car owners and from telephone directories and magazine subscribers, the people selected were mostly from higher income families. Remember, the year is 1936, and thus probably mostly Republican. Therefore, they chose the Republican candidate, Landon, even though there were 10 million people surveyed in that one and only 50,000 in Gallup, and they were correct. And incidentally, the Gallup poll is still used today as one of the most respected forms of surveying and different things like this. And our next one, suppose that you want to estimate the total amount of money spent by students on textbooks each semester at Southern Methodist University. You collect register receipts for students as they leave the bookstore during lunch one day. So which source of bias would fit this situation? We get to attribute the sources of bias as convenient sampling because it's easy for you to stand there and collect receipts from everybody that walks out, or also from undercoverage because students who buy books from online bookstores are not included. Only the students that bought from, so this should say not included. And our last example, it says to find the average value of a home in Plano, one averages the price of homes that are listed for sale with a realtor. What sorts of bias would come into play in this type of sample? Undercoverage. This leaves out homes that are not for sale or homes that are not listed with, or homes that are listed with different realtors. This concludes tonight's video. Please do not forget to bring your notes to class tomorrow.